Hey guys, and welcome to this tutorial, in which I'm gonna show you how one may draw hair realistically. Therefore, you need a pencil, the softer the better, charcoal, either a charcoal stick or charcoal powder, a black pen or fine felt tip pen, and maybe, but not necessarily, a white pastel pen or acrylic paint, as well as a brush. As always, this tutorial is meant for everybody, no matter what stage of drawing skills you are at. So, without further ado, let's begin! First of all, I begin lining out today's motif. And as you can see, the hair makes up almost half of the picture. If you feel a little bit insecure about sketching out human shapes, I'd recommend using a grid, like this one or a more detailed one, marking certain heights and widths, whatever you feel the most comfortable with, or to watch my short video clips about human proportions and how to get them right. Now we're gonna line out the hair's shape, which in our case mainly consists out of loose hair strands, as well as two thick braids running along the girl's head. Therefore, we will just concentrate on the more prominent strands of hair, directly catching your eye and giving the hair its movement and flow. For the braided part, that's pretty easy, since that's literally the braid's outline. For the looser part, however, that might be slightly more challenging, but once you've understood what to look out for, it's gonna be pretty easy too. I kind of restyled the girl's hairstyle, so I can't really show you a reference picture, but I sketched out these parts first. In this picture, for instance, I would perceive these strands or chunks of hair as the most prominent ones. And as a little tip or trick, if there are no strands of hair directly catching your eye, either because of their shape, coloring or size, just look at the picture from further away to see whether something does so from a greater distance. So first we're gonna sketch out the braids, beginning with the two middle braids that would run along each side of her head towards its middle and meet there. Therefore I marked said middle of the girl's head and drew the last braided row on each side, before they would be tied together into one tail. When you're drawing the braid's outline above her ear, ensure to make a curve or bump for each braided row. As you can see, each braided row should be formed out of two thick strands of hair, an upper and a lower one. For this braid, I wanted the upper strands to protrude over the lower strands, so each upper strand could disappear beneath its neighboring upper sibling. So each strand should be the thickest at the beginning of each braided row, make a swerve upwards for the lower strands and downwards for the upper strands, and end in a thinner tip. Due to the perspective, I slightly decreased the volume and size of the braid towards the girl's forehead. For the second braid, the method is the same as before. The only difference is that the hair is woven into another direction. So now the left hair strands should be slightly longer than the right ones. And also, this braid should be a little bit smaller than the first one. Then I worked on the part with the loose hair by lining out the prominent hair strands I was just talking about a minute ago. Unfortunately, I forgot to film the remaining part of that process. So here's a picture of what the outlines should look like. Before I begin working on shading the hair, I also sketched out the mirror and a rose, sitting on the girl's shoulder. If you're struggling to get the mirror's shape right, you could use a grid like the one I've shown in the beginning. You could even add horizontal or vertical lines marking the mirror's middle. I wanted that mirror to look quite old and a little bit playful, so I included many curves and small details. Then I drew the rose, beginning by lining out the rose's outline and carefully adding rose petal for rose petal. Now we are getting to the most exciting part of this whole video, which is the hair's shading process. Let's take a quick look at how the basic shading method works, or how you can achieve a smooth color gradient, or in our case a smooth gradient from darkness to light. If you already know how to do that, you might want to skip this mini crash course. As you can see, there are 4 levels of darkness, with the black pen being the darkest and charcoal the lightest. I always like to build up shadows by starting with the darkest part and working my way towards the lightest part. However, if you're not quite sure how dark a shadow should be, slowly build it up by starting with a lighter tone or applying less pressure at first. The black pen is not always the best choice for the darkest parts of shadows, since shadows come in different intensities and levels of darkness and hardness. So for a very light shadow, you might use the pencil or even charcoal for the darkest part. Now we are gonna try to do smooth gradients, first for each drawing utensil and then by using all of them together. Take the black pen and start drawing. First, create a very neat and fully covered area to make it as dark as possible. Press as hard as possible on the pen. The further you move towards the light, the more single strokes you should make and the less pressure you should put on the pen. Increase the distance between your strokes as well. It's totally fine if this part does look patchy. It's very hard to achieve a smooth gradient just using a pen. For the crayon, apply the most pressure where it should be the darkest and less the further you move towards the light. However, try to fully cover the whole field with crayon, so you don't need to do single strokes or increase the distance between your strokes. Now take a brush and brush over the whole area. Actually, you could also use a cut and swap, since this works even better for crayon than the brush. Do the same procedure for the pencil, this time preferably with the brush again though. For the charcoal, put the most once again where it should be the darkest and less towards the light. You don't need to fully cover the field this time, since the charcoal spreads quite wide when you brush over it. Now we are gonna combine our utensils to create the perfect gradient from darkness to light. Begin with the black pen in the same way as we did a minute ago. Take the crayon and start drawing where the pen part fades out, which automatically fills in the patchy pen. Apply the most pressure on the transitioning area where the pen turns into crayon. Smoothen out the crayon part. Add the pencil, again not just next to the crayon, but already where it fades out, so draw a little bit over its edge, and brush this one out as well. Last but not least, add the charcoal. To make the charcoal blend into the white paper, just use the brush and try to drag it out as much as possible. Finally, take, if possible, a looser brush and go over that whole thing a few times to make it really smooth. Well done guys, now you've already mastered the basic concept of shading. First of all, I picked an area of the hair to begin with, which is in this case the upper part of the hair, reaching from the hairline to the middle braid. I'd always recommend to begin by sketching out all the darkest parts first, where shadows would be cast and no or the smallest amount of light would reach the chosen area. This will give you orientation and help to set the shadows into relation with each other, so that you're gonna be able to picture the shadows' dynamics amongst each other correctly. Especially if you're new to shading, that approach might be very helpful. Otherwise, I often find that one concentrates too much on single areas too soon, so that they get too dark or too light compared to the other shadows. Now we are gonna apply the basic shading method from the mini crash course a moment ago. Therefore I used the pencil. We won't need any other drawing utensils for this process to darken the hair lying directly beneath the upper braid, casting a thin shadow. Again, put more pressure on the pencil directly next to the braid's outline, where it would block most of the light, and less pressure the further you move away from the braid, where it wouldn't be able to block the light anymore at some point. Take the brush to smoothen the shadow out. Then I worked on the shadows along the middle braid. This time also beginning to give the braided hair a little bit structure by adding several strokes or lines from the braided row's beginning towards its middle. Again, brush this part out. Unfortunately, at this point, the light began to reflect itself on certain parts, drawn with the pencil, and appeared much brighter on the camera display than they actually turned out to be. So please keep in mind that these shiny silvery parts you might see here and there are much darker in reality. Next, I sketched out the shadows along the loose hair, between the upper and middle braid, before I turned to the braid again. These shadows would be formed by thicker strands or chunks of hair lying over other parts. Also, basically the head's rounded shape is similar to that of a ball, at whose bottom a shadow would be cast if the light source were above, since the least amount of light could pass through to said bottom. That's why the hair often appears slightly darker at the head's bottom, so to say, especially if the hair lies quite neatly on top of that area, like in this case. Here, on the example of this braided section, you can see quite beautifully how this pre-shading works along the braids. First, I used the pencil to draw two lines, dividing the upper hair strand into three parts, and slowly expanded the shadows along these parts. Again, the shading should be the darkest at the strand's tip, where it disappears into the next braided row and most of the light would be blocked. Also a little bit darker where the braided section grows out from the previous one, and the brightest around the middle. Again, the brighter middle and darker ends enhance the braided strand's shape, since that's where it would have the most volume and protrude the most. So now that all the pre-shading is done along the upper area, we can move on to the real shading process. Therefore, I decided to concentrate on the loose hair part between the upper and middle braid. Basically, we're just gonna continue dividing our bigger and more eye-catching chunks of hair into even more strands, being more delicate and subtle. Also, I presume to expand the shadows we've already laid out during the pre-shading, especially the shadow above the middle braid, which actually turned out as one of the darkest and largest shadows. Unfortunately, that's exactly where the light is reflected by the drawn pencil part. So here's a picture of the end result to give you an idea how dark it should actually be. I wanted to lay a shadow in the middle of the first big section of hair and the strands on both sides of that section to be brighter, which is really essential, especially for the strand on the right side, since it helps to distinguish this whole big chunk of hair from the neighboring one, which would be darker again. Also, I added a few single hairs peeking out from the hairstyle. Make sure not to put too much pressure on the pencil when drawing these. Now we are getting to filling in the remaining part of the first big section, being left blank until now with single hairs. Therefore, it's really important to draw in single strokes, guys, to mimic the hair's structure. When you want these single hairs to be darker in certain areas, which is in this case right above the middle braid, just put a little bit more pressure on the pencil and less pressure again where you want the hairs to be brighter, here towards the upper braid. You can always use the brush, like I did quite often during that process, to make everything look smooth by repeatedly brushing over an area, making everything come together, and also when you want an area to be just a teeny tiny bit darker. You can always make shadows or small strands, dividing the hair into sections, darker or even a little bit lighter, once you've completed an area, because then you've got a better overview and can see how the hair and its shadows or highlights interact with each other. When you're getting to the small, bright strand, sectioning that first bigger part off from the neighboring hair strand, make sure to add a few very fine and soft lines along the small strand's middle to mimic a few of the single hairs forming that strand. And again, the darker middle part of that big hair section should get lighter the further you move upwards, towards the upper braid too. Always leave a few thin and brighter hairs or small strands in between if possible. The last strand, lying directly beneath the upper braid, should be quite dark as well, since the braid would cast a shadow on it. Therefore, I used a black felt tip pen, very carefully dabbing it a little bit in with my little finger. Next, I turn to the area of loose hair below the middle braid. Make sure to follow the hair strands flow from the upper part of loose hair so that you continue the hair structure in a way it actually makes sense. Apart from that, just apply the same technique we used for the upper part. Keep in mind that this part should be pretty much in the shadows, so it should be much darker than this thick strand where the hair we've just drawn would be kind of gathered. Now to the braids. Again, we do the same thing as before. With the braids, we can draw shorter strokes though, since each braided row is quite short and there are more mini hair strands woven into the braid. Also, for this middle braid, leave a brighter strand on top of each braided row and make the braid quite dark at the back of the head, where the head blocks most of the light in this position, so there would be a pretty dark shadow, and lighter the further you get towards the girl's forehead. Keep in mind that a shadow would be cast on one of each braided row's end, either where it comes out from a previous braided row and or where it disappears beneath another one. Like I've already mentioned at the beginning, I mainly used the pencil for drawing the hair and just a few times the black crayon. However, for the darker shadows, I carefully used the black felt tip pen quite often. So if the pencil isn't dark enough for your shadows, please see whether the black crayon does the job first, before trying the felt tip pen, since you can't really remove the felt tip pen once you've drawn with it. Also, the shadows on the upper braid don't need to be as dark as the ones on the middle braid. The loose hair above the upper braid on top of her head should be slightly brighter than the loose hair part beneath the braid. So basically the method is always the same. First, sketch out the more prominent hair strands or bigger chunks of hair catching your eye and giving the hair its shape, movement and flow. Then begin to sketch out all the darkest areas or more prominent shadows before working on the smaller and more detailed strands and shadows along an area. Always consider how the head's shape, position and the way the hair folds or is constructed into a certain hairstyle would affect the shadows being cast on the hair and the highlights. Last but not least, when the hair's basic structure is laid down through the previous steps, you can begin to fill in the remaining space with single hairs by drawing many single strokes. The loose hair beneath the lower braid should be much more wavy than the loose hair on top of the girl's head. So please keep in mind to draw more curvy strokes to mimic the hair. Include a few hairs peeking out to the sides from this part of the hairstyle again. Additionally, the lower braid should be slightly brighter than the middle braid.